work?
When we think about endurance, I would like to open up the conversation to include more things than people generally do when they hear the word endurance. So if we just think about what you typically ask your body to do or would like to ask your body to do, and we just walk through them, it's going to be things like this. Number one, I want to have energy throughout the day. That's actually a form of endurance. Great. I don't want to have these lulls and fatigue, and I want to feel fantastic as I move throughout my activities of daily living, whatever those may be. Work, exercise, enjoyment, paying attention, focus, all that stuff. Great. That's one thing. Another thing you want to ask your body to do is, I want to be able to repeat some small effort in a muscle group and feel great about that. This is what we generally call muscular endurance. So this is something like, I want to be able to walk up those 10 flights of steps and my quads aren't burning at the end of it, right? Or it even gives me energy. Another thing you'll want to ask your body to do is to be able to perform a tremendous amount of work for a longer period of time, something in the realm of 20 to 80 seconds. So this could be something like if you're surfing and you've got to paddle extremely hard for a minute to get on top of a wave, or you're out riding your bike and you need to be able to get up a hill and it's a very steep hill. These are going to take maximal efforts for some small amount of time, and then you'll get back up there. We tend to call that maximum anaerobic capacity. So that the max amount of work you can perform at a high rate for some amount of seconds to like maybe a minute. Past that is your ability to repeat an effort kind of like that for something like 5 to 15 minutes. And the example would be run a mile, right? Some interval like that, which is a longer distance, right? That is going to be your maximum aerobic capacity. Okay? Another thing you're going to want your body to do is what we call sustained position. So this is, you want to be able to sit in your chair at work and have perfect posture for 20, 30, 40 minutes, right? You want to be able to stand in line at a grocery store for 15 minutes and not have a breakdown in posture. So you want to be able to maintain position when you're riding your bike, you're not collapsing, you're doing any of these activities, and you don't get hurt or lose efficiency simply because you couldn't sustain basic positions, all right? Whatever those shapes and positions need to be. Okay. And then the last one is a maximum distance. So you want to be able to go for a longer hike or have just a long day at Disneyland for whatever it needs to be and feel great at the end of it, right? So the goal with all of these things is not can you just do them, but can you do them and then you feel good afterwards. So we're back in a right position where they give you energy, you feel good about it, and it's not just something you had to do and you regretted and you felt awful. So those are the factors I think about when someone says, I want better endurance, is I want to walk backwards and say, okay, when you say endurance, what do you mean? And that's generally the things I've come across as, if you can handle all of those things, you're going to feel like you're in fantastic shape. You're going to feel your recovery is going to be excellent, and your physical performance in the gym or in any of the sporting activities you do will be enhanced.
Given what you told us a little bit earlier, that endurance really reflects fatigue management and energy production, how do each and both of those things relate to endurance at a mechanistic level?
Sure.
I mean, really what I'm asking is, what is fatigue management and what is energy production?
In order to do that, it's important that we understand all of those functional capacities that I just talked about. They all have different points of failure. Okay. So in order to then work backwards and say, well, how do I optimize my performance in all those categories? We need to go through each one and figure out, well, where am I failing? Some of them are going to be failing because of fatigue management, and some of them will be failing because of energy production issues. So if we walk through a little bit of how we make energy and how we handle fatigue, then we're going to have a better understanding of exactly what to do for each one of these categories if you feel like one of them in particular is worse for you or lagging behind, or if in general you just want to improve all of them. All right, now I want to make a little bit of a 90-degree turn here. I'm going to do it with strategy though, I promise. And I want to ask you a very simple question. How do you lose weight?
I was taught that the calories in, calories out thermodynamics of energy utilization governs most everything. That is, if I'm ingesting less caloric energy than I burn, then I'm going to lose weight. And if I'm ingesting exactly as much as I burn, I'll maintain weight. And if I ingest more than I burn, then I'll gain weight.
Sure, that is the approach you would take. What I'm asking really is, how are you actually physically losing the weight?
So my understanding is that we have different fuel sources in the body: glycogen, which is stored in muscle and liver; body fat, which is stored in mainly white adipose tissue, and which is subcutaneous and around our organs, intravisceral fat, and that we can also use protein as a fuel. And then, as I recall, there's also a phosphocreatine system. And I think you're going to tell me that each of these systems is tapped into on different timescales and perhaps according to different levels of exertion. And I'm certain that what I just said is not exhaustive, but hopefully it is most or entirely correct.
Pretty correct. What's that got to do with fat loss?
At some point, body fat stores, adipocytes, fat cells, are going to start liberating fat as a fuel source. And the stimulus for that, I'm assuming, is going to be that other fuel sources are either depleted, or that the energy and metabolic systems of the body, I don't want to say decide because they don't have their own consciousness, but are signaling in a way that registers that body fat would be the optimal fuel source given how long or intensely a given activity has been performed.
Okay, we have some stuff to clean up there, but we're still not really answering the question. How am I actually losing that body fat?
How is it actually leaving the body?
Correct.
My understanding is that it leaves the body through respiration.
Aha. So now we have some interesting things to talk about. How am I actually losing fat via respiration? What the hell does that even mean? How is something that occupied this physical space on the side of me leaving my body through my mouth? And there's a very clear answer there, right? Which I'm sure you're queued up to. When you take a breath in, you're generally breathing in oxygen, O2. There's some other things, but we'll just stick to oxygen. When you exhale, you're breathing out CO2. The difference between those two is that carbon molecule. Well, one of the things that's important to understand here is all of your carbohydrates, which is that word itself is a carbon that has been hydrated. So it is a carbon molecule attached to a water molecule. It is a simple chain of carbons. Your fat molecules are also chains of carbon. All of metabolism really, in terms of energy production, is simply trying to figure out a way to break those carbon bonds. As a result, we get energy from that. We use that energy to create a molecule called ATP, which is the central source of energy for any living being, right? That carbon is then floating around in free form, which is bad news internally. So we've got to figure out a way to get that carbon out of our system. So all of energy production, all of fatigue management really comes down to this core issue of how are we handling carbon and how are we moving it around the body? And so what we do is we do this sneaky thing. So another question I like to ask people is, why do we breathe?
Well, for two reasons. To bring oxygen into the system and to offload carbon dioxide. But the neural trigger for breathing is when carbon dioxide hits a threshold level in the set of neurons in the brainstem and elsewhere, activate the phrenic nerve or the gasp reflex or a combination of things, and we inhale or inhale.
Right. So a reduction of oxygen intake generally doesn't stimulate ventilation unless you're at altitude. Then that sort of changes, right? In general, it's an elevation in CO2 that's going to stimulate breathing out. The only reason you bring in O2 for the most part is to get rid of the CO2. Oxygen is not a fuel source. It is not a way, and it works the same with fire, by the way. So you know you have to have oxygen present for a fire to go, and if you squelch oxygen, the fire will go out, right? That's sort of half of how those like fire extinguishers work. But we think then that means oxygen is the fuel. It is not the fuel. It is something entirely different. It is a necessary a product that is necessary for the metabolism process to actually occur. All right, so we're kind of dancing around an idea here, which is this carbon cycle of life. So what happens in plants is they generally will breathe in the opposite and breathe out the opposite of humans. So a plant will breathe in CO2 and exhale O2. All right, this is why we have to have a certain amount of these things in algae and forests and trees and stuff to maintain this O2, CO2 balance in our atmosphere. We do the opposite. And so we have this wonderful circle of life. We breathe in O2, breathe out CO2. They do the opposite. Well, what happens is because carbohydrates are long chains of carbon and fats are as well. Generally, when we think about fats, by the way, it's important to understand that structure a little bit. So if we think about triglycerides, it is a 3-carbon backbone chain of glycerol. So it's 1, 2, 3. And horizontally running off of each one of those are fatty acid chains, right? And so we form this structure that looks like an E, right? Like the letter E, 3 in the back, and then 3 chains coming off of it. Each of those chains are called fatty acids, and each of those fatty acids are a length of carbon, right? Or a number of carbons strung together. However many carbons are there determines which type of fatty acid it is, right? So stearic acid, linoleic acid, like any different number of things. It's also what determines whether or not it is a monounsaturated or polyunsaturated, as if carbon requires a special thing called a double bond. So if there's a double bond across every carbon and carbon, then they're all fully saturated and you're great. If there's any of them that are not double bonded, in fact, an example, if there is one that doesn't have a double bond, that is now called monounsaturated. And if there are many, it is called polyunsaturated. So there's pros and cons to all of these things. Right. In either case, we're still talking long carbon chains. So what a plant will do is bring in carbon. And then it has this wonderful ability to use energy from the sun called photosynthesis. And it can take those carbons that it inhales and use the energy from the sun to form a bond. Now, in our prior discussion when we were going over hypertrophy, we talked about the energy that was required to go through protein synthesis. That's because forming a new atom or a new bond between atoms oftentimes takes energy. In this case, it does. The same thing happens here. So if a plant does not have oxygen or does not have carbon dioxide in the air, it has no fuel. Basically, think about it as that's what it eats. It needs to get nitrogen from the ground and the soil, just like we need to get nitrogen from our protein. But fuel-wise, it needs to get carbon dioxide. Then it needs sun to give it energy so that it can actually form that bond, right? That's what it's getting its fuel from. All right. So if we think about a classic plant that produces either a starch or a fruit, here's what happens. It inhales that carbon and then it starts packing it away. Now, in a root vegetable, what it does is it stores those things together. And if we store that thing and we grow a fruit at the bottom of it, we tend to call those things starches. All right? It's going to then take the carbon that is packed away in its root and send it up the tree. And it's going to actually do that by breaking it down into a smaller form of carbohydrate that we tend to often call things like sucrose and glucose. It'll ship that up the tree, it'll go out to the leaves, and it'll convert it into the fruit. And it's going to eventually transform that stuff into smaller carbon things called fructose. And if we think about the fruit or the sugar in fruit, it's often in the form of fructose or sucrose or a combination, and sometimes glucose. So we have these smaller 6 carbon chains, generally in the form of glucose, that are being made from this larger storage of carbohydrates that we call starch, right? So it's packed in together. Your body does the exact same thing. So if it's a potato and it has a whole bunch of glucose packed away, we call it starch. If it's in your quadricep and we pack about a whole bunch of glucose away, we now call it glycogen. If it's in your blood as that 6 carbon chain, we call it glucose. If it's in the tree and in the fruit, we call it fructose. Right? Those are different molecules, but that's effectively the same thing happens. So the biology, the chemistry is almost identical. It just runs in the reverse order. And that's why, again, tubers and potatoes and stuff tend to be starches, and fruits tend to be glucose, fructose, and sucrose. So we have this wonderful circle of life. The plants can survive on just breathing in the CO2 and then getting the energy from the sun. We don't have that ability, at least to my knowledge, to run through photosynthesis. So the only way we can get carbon into our system is to actually ingest carbon, which means we have to eat the starch, the fruit, the animal, some other form of stored carbon to get that into our system. We then pack that away. We put the carbohydrates, as you mentioned earlier, either in our liver, our blood, or in our muscles. We put the fat generally in adipose tissue. We'll put a little bit in muscle cells as intramuscular triglycerides. And then the protein we'll use as structure, right, to do different things. We don't like to use protein as material or fuel. It's better used as structure. And what we have to do then is if all of a sudden we realize that storage is getting too much in our body, in other words, we're gaining too much weight, we have to figure out how to get the carbons out of our body. And that is metabolism, right? Anytime we're trying to break a carbon bond so that we can get energy to make ATP, that's going to release the carbon out of our tissue into the blood. We have to bring in oxygen to bind that carbon molecule to make CO2 so we can exhale it and put it back into the atmosphere.
It's a beautiful description of the circle of life. And energy utilization in the human body, I have to ask the question that I'm sure many people are wondering about, which is if indeed we exhale these carbons, and as it relates to fat loss, that is the way that we lose fat if we're in a subcaloric state, for instance. Has it ever been explored as to whether increasing the duration or intensity of exhales can accelerate fat loss? I mean, that's sort of the logical extension of what you described. And here I'm actually interested equally in whether or not the answer is yes, as well as whether it could be no. Because I could imagine if the answer is yes, well, then there's some interesting protocols to emerge from that. But that if it's no, it will reveal to us some important bottlenecks about metabolism and energy utilization.
You ever seen those magicians who like show up and they can tell your mom's name or something like that before you because they can sort of lead you down a path?
Yeah, I mean, not to take us down a deep dive tangent, but I once went to the Magic Castle in Los Angeles, and I was one of the people called up front, and an incredible magician named, I think his name was Ozzy Mind or something, I think that's right, had me write my name on a card in a Sharpie pen. I ripped up the card. I ripped it up. I put it in my pocket. And at the end of the 10 or 15 minute bout of him doing a bunch of other tricks, he asked me to look in my right shoe, and under my foot in my right shoe was that card intact.
Yeah.
And it was no longer in my pocket. And I swear on my life, I wasn't a collaborator with him.
Yeah.
And to this day, it still gives me chills because I don't know how, magic.
Yeah, right, magic. Well, the reason I say that is I've given that little spiel that I just gave you countless times in my classes. And I would say 99% of the time, as soon as I stop, the very first question is, so can I just like do a bunch of exhales and lose fat? Which is wonderful because I was really hoping you would do that, and you rolled right into my trap. Right? You landed perfectly. So I look like a magician over here.
I feel like I should look in my right shoe right now. No, I asked the question because it's the logical extension of what you laid out, but I know biology to be both diabolical and cryptic, but also exquisite in the way that things are arranged, and you don't get something for nothing.
There are no free passes in physiology. That's the saying. No free passes. The answer to your question is yes. 100% yes. In fact, that is the only way to go about it. You have two options. You can ingest less carbon, or you can expel more carbon. People always say calories in, calories out. It's really carbon in, carbon out. That's what a calorie is, right? Calorie is the amount of energy we get per breaking a carbon bond. So it's really less in, more out. Less in is fairly obvious, whether that comes in any form. And by the way, this is exactly why the percentage of your intake coming from fats or carbohydrate, it doesn't really matter that much. If you look at fat loss, clinical trials, you guys may have covered this when Lane was in here. I'm sure like this is something he talks about a lot. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant because it's not about that. There's nothing magic in those things. They are different and they have different physiological responses. Everything is different, right? No doubt. But in general, it's just simply about carbon intake. Turns out fat has a lot more carbons per mole than carbohydrates do. So there's more calories per mole in there. So if the physical amount of fat needs to come in as a smaller amount, physical amount of carbohydrates will come in as a larger amount, but you can play any number of very high carb, low fat. What matters? Total calories, right? Again, it's not like the only thing that matters, but you know what I'm saying?
Sure.
Some percentages in the way can go. Fat loss works fantastic. High fat, low carbohydrate. Why do all these things work? Because that's not about that. It's about total intake of carbon, total expel. So absolutely, can you lose fat by simply exhaling more? In fact, that is exactly what you did this morning.
When I hopped on the Airdyne bike
when you did anything, right? The question is, can you think of a scenario in which you could have a bunch of increased rates of exhalation that helps in fat loss?
Sure. I can think of a lot of things that will stimulate increased rates of exhalation.
One thing could be simply going, right? And so the question is like, can I literally do some breath protocols where I force exhale and lose fat? And the answer is yes. But what happens? What happens if you do hyperventilation training?
Well, my lab studies cyclic hyperventilation as one of our many deliberate protocols. And one of the most prominent things that one observes is that levels of adrenaline increase very quickly.
Extremely quickly.
People feel jittery, anxious, stressed, and unless they are consciously trying to anchor their thinking about what that means and the benefit set to persisting, typically they abort the cyclic hyperventilation protocol really quickly.
Within seconds, right? You will feel tingling, sweating, all kinds of things. You're hyperventilating, right? And we could talk ad nauseum about how that changes everything from adrenaline to focus to a whole bunch of things. So unfortunately, a strategy of sitting around, just exhaling more than you inhale, technically helps you lose more fat, but it's not going to last very long. So then the question is, well, how do I get into a situation or a scenario in which I can increase my rate of expiration where I'm not going to pass out and I'm not going and altering hypocapnia and hypercapnia issues? Any idea of a situation in which you would have an enhanced rate of expiration without worrying about passing out?
Sure. Steady state exercise.
Or not steady state exercise, lifting weights, intervals, moderate training, repeated, any of these things. They all work equally for fat loss because all they're doing is increasing respiration rate. They're saying increased demand for energy, increased exhalation. That's the trick here. And when you equate these things to that, they have equal success in fat loss. It doesn't matter, theoretically, where you're getting it from. And so when we get into this idea of, well, what are the best training strategies for fat loss? It doesn't matter which one of these tactics you pick, as long as you maintain a consistent adherence over time. Because of this exact fact. It doesn't matter if you're burning quote unquote fat in the exercise session, or if you're burning carbohydrates in the exercise session. It is totally irrelevant to your net fat loss over time. Okay, now there's some significant misconceptions there about what I just talked, and I would love to come back and walk through that in more detail. But that's the main take-home message here. It won't matter what's coming in, and it won't matter what's coming out, because in either case, it is the same rate of oxygen in and CO2 out. That's the key metric. And hopefully this helps a lot of people have some relief, because they're like, man, you're so tied up on what is the exact protocol for training for optimizing fat loss. What's the exact nutritional intervention I need for fat loss? And then you wonder why all these different diets can work effectively, and wonder why all these different training protocols. And surely you know somebody who lost a bunch of weight and the only thing they did is they just started running. There was no advanced protocol. They just started running and they ran 5 miles every day. That works. And then tons of people who tried that and didn't lose anything. And lots of people who went to, I went to cardio kickboxing class, lost weight. Oh, I just started doing intervals on my, why? Mysteriously, do all these things work? Some spidey sense has to be going off in your brain where there has to be something linking these things. And what's linking it is simply carbon exchange. So put yourself in a position in which you are exhaling more than you are inhaling without passing out. The other problem is if you were to simply do a breathing protocol, while the rate of exhalation would go up, after that you would correct and go in the opposite direction. So that's the problem, is your net carbon output over the course of the day is not going to change unless you increase the demand for energy. And that's how you get into that negative state.
Along these lines of exhaling carbons as